I'm Majida Barghet. Hello. I'm Majida Barghet, the Interim Director of the Center for International Studies. Welcome here. I know it's a very pretty weather, and you have been very courageous to come attend a lecture with this incredible weather. So it's our pleasure, our honor to have today Professor Cohn, who is visiting us for the second time this year, and I hope it's not going to be the last one. We will do more, and I selected the smallest introduction possible because I know you are here for him, and I know you can also go online and have more about him. But so, as briefly as possible, I'm going to introduce him, saying that he's a professor of sociology at Texas A&M University. Please come on in. He's the author of two major books on the materialist theory of discrimination and one book on the strategic optimization of the strategy for working class gains. His most recent work has been on underdevelopment in northeastern Brazil. He has been working with progressive Brazilian scholars to model the effect of new states' policies on poverty in the fact of globalization. He holds a Fulbright in the economics department at the Universidade Federal Fluminense in Spanish, yes, but Portuguese.
Close enough.
In Rio de Janeiro in 2002, one of the leading heterodox economics departments in Brazil. He has done field work in Sergipe?
Sergipe, yes, that's correct. She's really good. Yes.
No, Mato Grosso, Rio de Janeiro, and Sao Paulo. He has done intensive econometric modeling of Brazil employment dynamics and has written on the limits of neoclassical solutions to poverty. I have a lot of things he has done here and achievements, but I think I'm going to let him talk because you're here for that. And please join me in welcoming Professor Cohn.
Okay. I'll get to my regular talk in a minute. That'll happen. I think we have a major critical development where we have people who want to know about Brazil. And often the simplest thing happens to someone who just wants to know about Brazil is often you can be really superficial about it. I want to know about development in Morocco. Almost every educated person who lives there knows the basics. I could ask Majida what's happening in Morocco. And even though she's not even there, I'm sure a development banker in the capital would do more, but you would probably give me a pretty good 85% approximation, and then simply fill in the details a little better. So very simply, what I wanted, if you're looking for crude insight on what everybody knows about Brazil, you simply pick up any business magazine. It's nice if you can read a language other than English. That's always a good life skill. Cough, cough. But in essence, the simple story is, hey, you're making a lot of money from bang, bang, bang. This is what's hot. That tells you. And from your point of view, you tend to be probably appalled. Because this tends to tell you what industries are going and what industries are not going, and the distribution and humanistic consequences of this growth are left utterly superficial by, if you will, what I call a Fortune magazine kind of way of studying development. And you will find plenty of Fortune magazine studies of any country you want, including by famous professors who get to fly around the world and give those talks. To find the humanistic strategies for development, what actually improves the welfare of people. And I'm very concerned about the fact that I just don't want to see GDP go up. You'd like to see people in the slums have a higher standard of living. You'd like to have more access to water, more access to sanitation, more access to a doctor, something like disposable income so that you can live in a concrete block house and not an improvised wood house of plywood that you found. In that world, you not only have to look at measures, which often involve some statistics of measures of well-being, but you often have to stand and look for the invisible strategies of development. The ones that are not obvious because they're hidden by the big, huge, neon light flashing headline story. In this newspaper, you want to get past the headline story because on page 8 there's critical stuff and no one reads through to page 8. Let me be more specific about that. Let's see a fresh slide. Yeah, thank you. Talk with me. Everyone I talk about Brazil because there's an idiotic unit people have called BRICS, they're a rich country. And you ask, why are they going in to give the Fortune magazine account of what's hot in China, what's hot in Russia, what's hot in India, what's hot in Brazil? If you really insist on knowing that, I'm going to give you the top 5 causes of Brazil's marvelous economic growth right now. Next slide. Secret number 1, oil. It's a petroleum country. Secret number 2, oil. Would you like to hear secret number 3? Oil. Can we have secrets 4 and 5, please? Oil, soybeans, but did I mention oil? They've got a nice export agriculture sector in soybeans. And at that point, quite frankly, yeah, there are countries that blow oil. There's a ridiculous literature called the resource curse literature that thinks that oil is somehow bad for you. And they've gotten better, well, you know, it's really institutional quality. Yes, you can blow oil. And excuse the football analogy, but you can also blow first down on the goal line and still not score, and people do that. Basically, having oil should be good. If you can't do something with this, you're lame as hell. Note here, cough, cough. Let's flip next slide. Americans with an axe to grind, which in American academia means 100% the same, okay, tend to use whatever's going well in Brazil to back up their pet theory of whatever. If you're on the left, Brazil has a left that we don't have, with participatory budgeting and town meetings where everyone gets together and chooses how money's going to spend. Never mind, a lot of those things are crashing and burning quickly, but they take either the progressive labor law, the leftist tradition, the participatory budgeting, and make up marvelous stories of how this is producing benefits for the poor. Never mind the fact that oil will induce even right-wing semi-fascists to pass some money down to the poor. If you are more of a business school neoliberal variety, you talk about the fact that Lula and now Dilma were pro-international capital leftists. They did not take on multinational capital, but they cooperated and maintained significant openness. You talk about tight monetary discipline, or you take the very introduction of neoliberalism of Bill Cardoso. Everyone has their God story. And the normal strategy is, I like this, Brazil's growing, I'm in. Okay? And frankly, the left and the right are just as bad as it, and I kind of get nauseous reading either one of them type of article. You know, spare me, please. Okay, let's flip on. So are there better questions we can ask that gets us past taking Fortune magazine and putting my favorite winner up first because it automatically wins? Well, I could ask, why does oil work for Brazil and not for Nigeria? If there's anyone who really cares about this during the question and answer, I prepared 3 slides on that. That's not where I want to go. But if you really care about oil economies, I will talk about that. You could ask, okay, we acknowledge factor number 1. What's factor number 2? What raises development net of oil? Which clearly is a gigantic question, and people are kind of boo-boo about that. Let's have another slide. We do better than that. Better still, and now this gets into post-developmentalist critique, Brazil's famous stereotype flaw that everyone acknowledges is what is called disarticulated development. Jargon fans, what that means is there's a small number of companies doing insanely well, a small upper class making gallons of money, a working class that is treated well. So if you are the one loyal worker I have in my company, even if you're working class, your union conditions are great. You know, working for an American multinational is terrific, no matter what country you're in. It's better paying conditions. Definitely better on gender and diversity issues, okay? However, everyone else is left in the slums because they hire very few people, they're capital intense, they move the money out of the country, and so in return for a GDP that looks great, most people are still living in squalor. So what articulated means, that's disarticulation and remove the DIS, is a humanistic, egalitarian, broadly dispersed development that puts money into the hands of poor people. It won't solve the ecological critique or defense of ethnicity or many of the other things, but certainly making sure that poor people get their fair cut of the action strikes me as an awfully good first round. Now, we can do better. What produces articulated development? Net of oil. Because oil done right, we'll ignore the pathological cases, oil spreads a lot of grease around. A lot of people pick up on an oil economy. Ask anyone in Texas or Louisiana. Now let's look down and find out what produces articulated development net of oil. Let's have a new slide. So how do you do this? Well, first of all, let's talk about what's going to help poor people now. This is the standard upper, it drives me nuts. Upper class, I care so much about the poor, speeches by the bourgeoisie about the poverty problem in our site. We are so uneducated. We need to fix our schools, and someday we will be competitive. All of which is true. The educational system is sometimes awful. If you've experienced an educational system, boy, do you have things to complain about. All of that's true. But it's also a polite way of saying until these people grow up and go all the way through the systems, we start getting the beneficiaries of the new system, nothing's going to be done. So I think I'm going to wait on this for 18 years. If you want to stop poverty now, you can't wait on the educational system to get around and do its business. You want something a little faster acting. So you study labor-intense industries. Industries that hire a lot of people, that don't hire a lot of machinery, that will make jobs for slum dwellers now. And you pick jobs with low educational thresholds, preferably those that also pay well. So a guy who's begging on the street, or a guy who's, a woman who's working as a maid, and that's okay, but she wants much better than this. She can do this, she gets her independence, and she's out earning what she had as a maid. She doesn't have to clean toilets anymore. These are the industries that have jobs that poor people can really get. Okay. The ones I look at are things that you don't normally study in development, because we want industries that will change our technology. We want industries that will make us modern. Well, if you're going to only study the capital-intense high-tech industries, you are playing right back into the hands of the disarticulation folks. You have marvelous technology and 3 people are benefiting. Your Linux programmer and his boss. All right, no glamour here. Barber beautician. Anyone can learn barber beautician in 6 months to a year. You're adequate. Often 3 months to 6 months, you're adequate. And in 2 or 3 years, you can get really, really good. All right? You can start earning money immediately, and by the time you're really, really good, you could be earning, okay, maybe it is only $4 an hour, but in the old days you were earning 75 cents an hour. From your point of view, even though this isn't objectively great money, it's a huge relative improvement in your status. Restaurant work. Waiting on tables may not be great. Cooking is pretty magnificent. Even bartending is pretty magnificent. And if you are preparing the regional specialties and you could put out a banquet of 100 working with your team, or you're a pretty good pastry chef, people will pay you for that. Hotels. Your stereotype job in hotel, oh, this is so awful, is that people change the sheets. Don't forget the desk clerk is not only literate, but has to know how to use a computer. This is a complex building that involves lots of blue-collar repair. Someone has to fix the plumbing, the wiring, the swimming pool. Now, they also, while we think of hotels as just beds, most hotels, particularly resort places, make the majority of their money selling food and drink. So see restaurant, okay? When you add those, that's now a serious body of semi-skilled jobs. Let's even imagine gendered occupations. We've always known how to cook something from being a kid, even living in the slum. Now you can take this, learn how to do this in a professional kitchen, you're up. And she's looking at the clock. Let's move. Next, I got a fly. There's more than just, okay, some rich oil places create tons of labor-intense jobs and others don't. Some poor places create tons and some don't. This is different than oil. So when you find who's good at creating jobs for poor people, it's what's technically the statistical term is orthogonal. It's got no relationship to the other factors, purely independent. Move, that's the next slide. How to find the missing invisible multiplier effect? I'll do this fast. It's a mathematical technique. Note, statistics counts in this. Learn your econometrics. It really helps. Even if you don't like the politics of people teaching you econometrics, you can improve on it once you get out of class, okay? You run a regression where you predict how much employment would have occurred due to stupid things like oil, stupid things like income, things that are independent of policy. Once you make those predictions, you can take a look at places that seem to have much more than you would expect from their oil, much more than you would expect from their income, much more than you would expect from some stupid location like being on the beach. No, duh, there's more hotels and restaurants near the beach. Okay, we clean that up. When you identify places with a high residual, they have a secret aspect. Something about them is creating employment above and beyond what you'd expect from your obvious stuff. Want to learn how to do good field work? Go to the places with unknown secret tricks for making jobs and learn what they do. So I went to the places that were the best performers in barber. We paid more barbers than anyone else, more hotel jobs than anyone else, and more restaurant jobs than anyone else. It was different places. And you simply put yourself on the ground, open your ears, and start figuring out what are they doing right. Next slide. And there I go. And then, to be really thinking, once you've got it, you can run a statistical test to test your theory, and then you go back in the field and make sure it still works and you're not full of potatoes. All right, next. This is the statistical model I ran. I'll be happy to discuss it in the later sections, but most of you guys aren't econometricians, so I won't bore you with 900 variables, but I didn't have to put in oil because I put in income. Places with oil have lots of workers with high income, so that covered that. And I put in things like being on a beach, whether or not you get a lot of tourism at UNESCO heritage sites, that kind of stuff. Things that aren't particularly related to income and social policy. Female labor force participation, you get a lot of restaurant work because women get to go out there. I don't want to cook tonight, we're heading out. Next. Sergipe. I go to Sergipe. I'll make this thing kind of fast. Sergipe is the clear readout place in barber beauticians. And in fact, just to make sure my statistics weren't a fluke, I did a block count going to this place is Delaware. It's a small, dinky place that no one respects. It's in the poor northeast. It's just south of the most corrupt state in Brazil that everyone correctly makes fun of because the government has always been crooked by Brazilian standards. And that's saying a lot. And it's not as cool as Bahia right underneath it. So that's a little bit like New Yorkers who make jokes about New Jersey. These Bahians make, Salvador, they make jokes about Sergipe, Bahia wannabes. And my computer said they got more barbers and beauticians than anywhere else. And it checked, I went up and down the streets, counting the barber and beauty shops and the number of chairs I saw in the capital city, and then doing the same thing in Ipanema. Actually, Copacabana, the same principle. Even with Copacabana's massive population concentration, it wasn't even close. Way more barbers and beauticians in Sergipe. Someone is doing something right to create jobs. Now, you notice odd things first. The first thing I noticed, in fact, let's see if it's on a slide. Flip down and say, oh yeah, zillions of barbers and beauticians. Next slide. A fantastic beachfront complex with great clubs, great restaurants. I love going to Aracaju, to Ottawa, and hanging out in the beach district. It was brand new because the district didn't exist 5 years before I came. The federal government put new sewers and water in, and there was political corruption with this. It's next to one of the richest residential neighborhoods in town. So the rich neighborhood neighborhoods for development got sewers put in next to their homes. Oh, thanks for the idealism. You would have been disgusted, all right? But that said, suddenly a crappy, smelly, they have rich houses next to a stinky, horrible beach you really wouldn't want to go to, is now totally wonderful and there's no reason not to do this. They built up this great entertainment complex and people literally come from miles around and every place is filled and they're spending, and there's a zillion cook jobs, waiter jobs, people selling beers on the beach, souvenir stores, bathing suit stores, everything you could want. So it's working out magnificently. And no, federal government puts in new sewers. Without the gov, nothing happens. The other thing is they put in a new airport. They thought that they'd get all these international tourists coming in. This beach is next to a butane refinery. There is no way that an American is taking a beach vacation next to a butane refinery. But people who came into Sergipe to do business on the airport and loved Atalaya brought their families back. So people who were a little less fussy than the international travelers were are pouring money into the economy. They had a great time in Arizona. Next. Subsequent analysis showed that places that got new airports and new sewage water systems all saw improvements in the labor-intense jobs. That this was a national trend. Next. Next thing, in Sergipe, once I noticed I'm on the beach, I still haven't figured out barbers and beauticians. It turns out that by giving a bunch of interviews to barbers and beauticians, we find they've got this giant job training program for barbers and beauticians, and all the old barbers are going, Christ, they're training all these new guys, how am I supposed to live? So they think this is all horrible. Okay, click on. Interviews with barbers and beauticians showed you have these new guys coming in and there really is no room to survive. The old people are being driven out of business. The young people can barely make it. Lots and lots of people who are like lawyers in law school today. Why did I pay for this education? I'm wasting my money and they go into something else. Well, let's imagine, we'd hypothetically make this you. You decide that you're going to be a beautician. You get your first course in beauty training, you're trying to make it and you can't get anything. You're dying. There's literally, and I'm not joking, no matter where you go in the city, 6 or 7 beauty shops already up. How are you supposed to do this? Well, you ask your family for help. They see you're in a jam, so they invest in your hairdryer. Note, if you're a poor slum dweller, a hairdryer, good enough for a beauty shop, is a significant investment that you never would have had as a 17 or 18-year-old. By putting in, you ask for your chair, you ask for something, the sink to wash. They end up investing in getting their family members covered to help them out because they don't want to waste the training. And the effect of this is a whole bunch of capital investment in the sector that never would have happened. Can you read Keynesian stimulus and the economics people? And so the family, in response to the government program, runs their own employment stimulus program. And it does make these places viable. You now have the equipment to compete. Carry on. Nationally, barber beauty correlated with government financed vocational training. The more you train, the more jobs you make. Next. Now, nationally this works. Brazil, in both the two most recent presidents, is a heavy investor in government financed infrastructure projects. Airports and water sewage get very serious money, and these things are being put in all over the country. Secondly, Brazil is the clear standout leader in Latin America for high-quality vocational education. Nobody does it as well as the Brazilians. Nobody makes more of it. No one has courses of the caliber of quality that the Brazilians have. Like the Germans have a comparable, this reputation for vocational education in Europe. The Brazilians have that niche in Latin America. So what I'm picking up on from the field reflects serious national policy and ministers and planners really hanging on this. Next slide, we need to give Ray a chance to talk. I'm getting near the tail end here. These positive effects replicate non-Brazilian settings. Government finance infrastructure correlates with employment, and this has been run for many nations, rich and poor, American and European and Global South, South Africa, India, lots of measures. So I have in one of my articles a review of the literature listing all the sites and places where investing in infrastructure creates jobs. It's massive. Vocational education tends to stink up the house in those tests. But it is one of the cheapest government programs you can, we have an administrator here. Think how much it costs to run a first grade research university and how much it would cost to just get a room and teach a course in hairdressing. Not even close for simplicity, okay? You can invest in the world's cheapest, world's greatest vocational education program for the price of a banana. So generally cost efficiency measures for the use of your scarce government dollar have vocational education working out super well, even if their hiring rates are lousy. Cohn's comment, I don't have hard data, but I believe this absolutely, and I'll go around with you. Usually when the programs fail, they say there's a bad relationship between what they're teaching and what employers want. I found the way you get around that is you put it in for occupations where people can self-employ. So you don't have to trigger what an employer is looking for. And so in Brazil, where I did run this test, I do have data on this point. If you compare industries where people can get their own jobs after they're trained, those have a much better job creation rate for the occupational spending, those where you're dependent on the goodwill of some company. Next, Brazilian lessons in economic development. And if you thought it was from the Obama running for president campaign, yeah, this will sound obvious. You've heard a certain political candidate who says we need to invest in infrastructure because that's our employment in the future. You might have heard that before. The Brazilian data pretty much looks like right out of that Bible. The government spending on infrastructure, whether it was physical or human, creates jobs. Cut it at your peril. And on that note, I'll pass on the stage.
Oh, no, we need more time.
All right. Okay, when we want to...
So we can do questions and answers now, or we can give them both to the end. What do you think? We can do both. But if you
Yeah,
have
well,
questions now,
let's hear the other part of the show, and then we'll go listen. People can sit and digest.
Okay.
Ray, you're on TV.
Oh my God, all right. It's really early, my
so I'm gonna very briefly introduce you, and I tried to be brief, but it's very difficult. So extremely honored again to have our own professor Blumberg presenting today, and as you know her, some of you are in sociology. Professor Blumberg is the William Keenan Jr. Professor of Sociology. She received her PhD from Northwestern in 1970 and joined the Sociology Department at the University of Virginia in 1998. She's also Professor Emerita of Sociology at the University of California, San Diego, Cohn, I believe. Her academic work revolves around two theories. First is a general theory of gender stratification found in such works as Stratification, Socioeconomic and Sexual Inequality. And then the second one is a general theory of gender and stratification and development.
Second one.
The second one. Okay. And gender, family, and economy, the triple overlap. Sage, 1991. The second is involving theory of gender and economic development as described in such work as making the case for gender variable, women and the wealth and well-being of nations. USAID, 1989, and Engendering Wealth and Well-being, Empowerment for Global Change, edited by Blumberg, etc., and several ones. So I'm going to skip some. In pursuit of her theories, Professor Blumberg worked in over than 45 countries, I think, if not more, in every continent except Antarctica. But I'm sure they will invite you. They don't know that. So I think I'm going to stop here to give her time to talk, and please join me in welcoming Professor Blumberg.
First of all, Sam is an incredibly hard act to follow, and I had started this with something I was going to read to you that might walk on the dark side in Afghanistan. Then I said, nah, I won't do it, but then it turns out we have someone here who is half Afghan, so maybe this will be familiar, and I will read this and then go on to my slides. Okay, so this is about gender development and war in Afghanistan and northern Uganda, but let me first tell you this about my actual walk on the dark side of gender stratification. In July and August of 2011, I was in Afghanistan doing 2 final evaluations for UNDP, the United Nations Development Program. On one hot August day during Ramadan, a new UNDP driver didn't know that the main entrance to the green zone of international development agencies, embassies, and ISAF, you know, the military headquarters, was almost around the corner from our building. Instead, he drove around and around. He took me to the far side, and we ended up in the center of the city in something called Masood Square. And he says, well, down there, you walk down there and you can get in. So on this side are all the barricades protecting the American embassy, and on the other side is a sidewalk. And, okay. Now, here's the problem. He was never supposed to have let me off like that in a public place. It was in a long deserted sidewalk that led to a turnstile, and it was a little used pedestrian entrance to the green zone. Now, Afghanistan was the 12th conflict country I've worked in out of 44 countries total since I was in the Peace Corps in Venezuela, but it was very scary. I was not in full hijab. I was wearing just a little flowered headscarf, and I was wearing a blouse that came down maybe to here and not to there. And I had worse, I had like only 3/4 length sleeves, and so I felt utterly naked, you know. And anyhow, the only other woman I could see was a beggar in a burqa. She was begging for change from drivers stopped at a light a block away. I walked alone along a metal fence. Behind it, I could see the steel superstructure for a building that was about 12 stories high. Later, I learned it was going to be a hotel, maybe a Marriott, but it seemed deserted. Still, I had a very strong feeling that someone was aiming at the center of my back. The walk to the turnstile and the board guard took forever. A few weeks later, on September 13th, 5 members of the Haqqani terrorist network, armed with rocket launchers, military automatic rifles, grenades, you name it, climbed that 12-story superstructure to the top, and they laid siege to the entire green zone for 20 hours. At first, no one had ever attacked it like that. So they probably were there as I walked past, and somebody probably was aiming at my back. So later I asked this famous sociologist that we both know, Randy Collins, who has studied war and violence, and I said, how could they have been so dumb, you know? Why so many security forces in the green zone permitted a structure that could look down on every building to be completely unguarded? Was this not a violation of rule number 1 about war, never let your enemy have the high ground? He said that each security force probably was sure someone else was doing it. So my tile is going to be about gender stratification and not a military blunder. And my point is that oppressing women is linked to armed conflict and lousy development, what you might call a trifecta of misery, okay? So that's what I wasn't going to read, and I ended up reading it, so let's put on the slides. Anyway, so I had given something that was sort of like the first chapter of this in our International Development Conference, November 1st through 3rd, which Sam co-organized and was here for the first time. And so this time I'm going to go a little deeper, and I'm going to be looking at relative equality and destiny of women in Afghanistan and among the Acholi of northern Uganda after 23 years of absolutely horrific war with one of the world's most, I mean, there are very few groups that have committed more atrocities in the world than the Lord's Resistance Army, or the LRA. And I'm going to look at why it was so. Okay, briefly, the overview. Afghan women have remained among the most oppressed on earth, while Acholi women, during and after the war, gained in economic power and freedom of movement. Now, for the why, I'm going to be looking at aspects of my gender stratification theories. Okay? Let's move on. So anyhow, I was there in northern Uganda in 2010, in March, April, and I did the baseline research for what would have been the very first development project that was not humanitarian assistance in 23 years. It had to be an infrastructure project, speaking of which, because the roads had become overgrown, and I mean trees growing in that little hump in the middle of the road on a sort of an unpaved road, jeep road. Deforestation, which I'll talk about, had brought drought, and that lowered the water table. So the wells in the villages had run dry. So that was the first two priorities. Get the road fixed so you can get to the village and help them get water. Then I already told you that in 2011 I did 2 UNDP final evaluations in Afghanistan, so let's move on. And now I'm going to do a little bit more on theory, but basically the kin/property system in both countries is pretty patriarchal. Inheritance goes almost 100% to males, including land, which is a big deal if you live in a rural society. When the young couple gets married, they practice what's called patrilocal residence, where the bride and groom go to live in the village of his male kin. And she arrives without friends, without allies. It's not pretty. Descent is reckoned only through males. Now, how do they make their living? Well, originally both were what we call dry or rain-fed agrarian based on plow agriculture. This is the world's most masculinized, male-dominated farming system, or what I call techno-economic bases. And so the women are seen as less productive, and basically they're rarely involved in the main cultivation activities whenever you have non-irrigated plow agriculture. Let's move on. Now, there were some gender differences between the two societies. Afghan women, especially Pashtun, the ethnic group Pashtun, from which we get the Taliban, have very limited freedom of movement. Most are traditionally housebound, but the Acholi women's mobility was not as traditionally constrained. Another thing is that Acholi women, even before what happened when they, which I'll tell you why they no longer practice plow agriculture, but anyway, but even before the women were already farmers, they were growing horticultural crops. This you do with a hoe. And it is considered to be female farming, and so they were seen as farmers. And then there was a big difference. The religious and ideological constraints on women in Afghanistan were much stronger than the ones on the Acholi women, whether pagan or Christian. Now there were some interesting similarities in both war and development. For example, in both places, intensive war has been the story of the last few decades. Some people have profited handsomely, but economic development has lagged in general, and the war in the militarized economy was a male economy, heavily favored men and hurt women. Civilian casualties, and we have rotten estimates for both countries, by a huge margin exceeded military casualties, but we really don't know just how big a margin. And the Taliban, as I say, are Pashtun based. You know, there are a few other people who might have joined, but the LRA is Acholi based. The leader, Joseph Cohn, was born not far from Gulu district where I was doing the work. But there's a crucial difference. Okay? The Taliban had a lot more support from the Pashtun people that they moved among initially before they took over the whole country than the LRA ever got from the Acholi, and I'll tell you why. The LRA used, I will turn your stomach if I told you what they did. Let's just say it involved frequent mutilations with machetes, chopping off limbs, doing terrible things to, well, I don't want to get into it. And, okay, Now, they also had a religious ideology, believe it or not. Joseph Cohn, who was a total nutcase, said he was going to govern with the Ten Commandments once he won power. I think there's one that says, "Thou shalt not kill," right? That one you never heard. But anyway, as you can imagine, these people who would be subjected to these unbelievably horrible attacks are not going to support somebody like that. And then they stole their children. They abducted little children, 9, 10, 11 years old. Those are their preferred ages. They turned the boys into child soldiers, and I shouldn't take the time, but I will. Look, they made the boy do an atrocity before he left his home village. They would ask him to kill a member of his family or a close neighbor, and the first boy would almost invariably say no. They would shoot him in the head. The second boy would probably be crying and scared, and ultimately, "I can't do it." Bang. Rarely did they have to kill a third boy. Okay? And off they marched. And they took with them a lot of the little girls to become porters and domestic drudges, and at that age, sex slaves. Use your imagination. Afghan villagers never were moved to camps, but Acholi villagers became what they call IDPs, internally displaced persons living in fortified camps. Now, there's a big difference in the techno-economic base or farming system. Afghan farming remains male-dominated. It's still grain-fed plow agriculture. The women are still marginal. Among the Acholi, what happened is that the government soldiers and the LRA both stole and then ate or sold the oxen that they used for plowing, and they also stole and then sold all the other farming equipment. So what happens if you were doing big field agriculture and you don't have that left to do? Well, even before the IDP camps, Acholi cultivation had already started to devolve because they were subject to all those raids, to horticulture. Horticulture is done again with a hoe, and it doesn't plow it doesn't get as deep, but you can raise a lot of crops, and it tends to be a female farming system. Almost everywhere in the world that's practiced, especially in Africa, here are only two things to point out. Women farmers in Africa raise up to 80% of food crops, locally grown food crops, and there they talk about the African farmer and her husband, or at least people in development who are not the farmer and his wife. And these women these days are increasingly able to earn some money by trade, market trade, which as now one statistic that I didn't put in the slide, it was an accident, 75% of the ethnic groups in sub-Saharan Africa are patrilineal or patrilocal, and it means women do not have land rights. But if they are raising some of the crops, and if they can take some of them to market or make things that they can take to market, they can get this counterbalancing form of power through their income because they can't have it from land. So what? So here are some hypotheses from my theories on why women's income matters. So then the gender stratification theory claims to be universal, and the theory of gender development continues to evolve as I go to more places. And economic power for both historical and theoretical reasons is posited as the most important and achievable form of power for women of what are recognized in sociology as the major forms of power, namely political power, force or violence, economic power, and ideology, okay? And if anyone wants to, here, you know how to do the camera? Oh, you don't know how to use cell phones. Okay, that's okay. He's pure. He doesn't do cell phones. Okay, moving on. All right. So here is the main variable, economic power, and I describe it as control of income and other important assets such as land, real property, animals, credit, inheritance, and I consider women's relative economic power in comparison with men to be the main, although not the sole variable, affecting the level of gender equality, and a variety of important outcomes that range from micro to macro levels. So the micro is the woman and her family, and her community as well. The macro is the nation, and also onto the global economy. So a couple of little hypotheses here. At the micro, greater women's economic power leads to the women having greater self-confidence and more say, more voice and vote in household decisions. Decisions about fertility, about their children's welfare, about their nutrition, their education, their health, and other economic matters of the family. And guess what? When women gain economic power, they tend to use it to curb their fertility. They have fewer children spaced farther apart, starting at a not as young age. Women then are more likely than their husbands to spend income that they control disproportionately on what economists call human capital, such as nutrition, health, and education. Now, these things have macro consequences as well. This is what's important, because fertility turns out to be inversely related to national income growth in developing nations. So F stands for female, and economic power boosts development. Children's human capital is like nutrition, as I said, education and health, but it's also linked to greater national income growth and well-being. So when you have women with economic power, it promotes development in both the better and the worse senses of the word, okay? I guess, let's move on. So, in fact, elsewhere I've written that women's economic power constitutes almost a magic potion for development, and their economic disempowerment is like a poison potion. It shrivels and kills development. Now, if you want to know, greater for women's economic power, and these are all empirically documented to the nines. It is associated with less violence, greater conservation of resources, lower corruption, lower HIV/AIDS. But when you have women's economic disempowerment, it's linked to the exact opposites, on top of which you will get less economic development and well-being at the national level, and it's also linked to something we have to all be worried about, fragile and failing states, okay? It doesn't take much women's economic power to make a difference. This will be seen with the Acholi women, who didn't earn that much, and it made a big difference, and the World Bank has already documented that Bangladesh, which has more microcredit, it's more saturated than any other country in the world, it has already led to a reduction in poverty, and the women's greater economic involvement has affected the GDP as well as well-being. They now have eliminated the gender gap in education through high school. They have themselves a nice textile industry, although we heard about the tragic fire on the Walmart supplier. And, but a lot of that was secondary consequences of the women getting the microcredit and using it for their family's benefit, and then the consequences spun out. Okay, now let's go back to the dark side, violence in armed conflict. And I have one that says, I have a hypothesis that says that where women have established economic power, they're less likely to be beaten. And at the macro level, Mary Caprioli has found empirically, she's a number cruncher who does the world's nation states, and she found an inverse link between women's labor force participation and both internal and international armed conflict. Summarized as AC. Okay, a 5% decrease in women's labor force participation is correlated with, she doesn't claim causality, a 500% increase in internal and international armed conflict. So let's do the math. A country with a 10% women's labor force participation rate has a approximately 3,000% higher probability of armed conflict than a country that has 40% of their women in the labor force. Let's move on. Now, there's something I'm going to just very briefly mention. I put in culture into my theory by using what economists might call discount factors, although maybe not quite the same way I use them. And they can be macro or micro. Macro discount factors for women are always negative in every country on the earth right now, but the levels vary, and they vary over time. For example, compare Sweden and Saudi Arabia. As you can imagine, the discount factor is far greater, more negative in Saudi Arabia than in Sweden. Or consider the United States. Go watch one of those sitcoms from the late 50s, early 60s on TV Land, Father Knows Best, and the Donna Reed Show, and Bieber, and I Love Lucy, and you'll see what things were like then, okay? In Afghanistan, the macro level discount factors are extraordinarily negative on every one of the indicators. And here's an example with respect to ideology. I was interviewing the number 3 official in the women's ministry, and she told me, and it's a quote, "Most Afghan men don't think that women are quite human beings." Are you being clear? Is that what you really meant? And she said yes. Okay, now the discount factors among the Acholi are nowhere near as negative, but the men oppose land for women because that's their primary resource. Luckily, it's easier for women to get income than land assets if your society is patrilineal and patrilocal. And as economists know, income is fungible. You can spend it on all sorts of things. Last negative factor, last theory factor is war close to home. Randy Collins, who I mentioned, and I both have put this into our different theories. War close to home, we say, is really rotten for gender equality, but we have different theories. The reason it's so harmful to women over and above the physical risk is that it precludes most possibilities for income-producing activities and for freedom of movement. So here are some of the key differences that the war had for gender stratification among the Afghans and the Acholi. For the women villagers in Afghanistan, war is always close to home. There can be an attack at any time. It precludes most economic activity and mobility. Men's dominance, I would argue, goes even further. For the Acholi, they got pushed into the secure IDP camps, and this negated much of the impact of war close to home. Camps forbade men to leave, but they let the women out. The women went out to collect firewood, and they also went out to do day labor in hoe cultivation, because even the rich people's oxen were killed and sold or eaten, and you had a lot of rich people living in the city who had farms, and they hired the women to do day labor out of the camps. And also the NGOs came in, and they taught, this is on a later slide, but they taught the women how to organize, they taught them all kinds of income generating activities, etc., etc. Meanwhile, the camp forbade men to leave, and they ended up basically curling into a booze bomb. Most of them just turned to alcoholism, and hard to blame. Anyway, so then the dependent variable in my theory is what I call life options, things that exist in all human societies, and in such things as marriage, divorce, fertility, which I would argue is the key life option for women. Any woman in this room, think back to how old you were when you started menstruating. I will give you 1 year without pregnancy, just in case. They call that adolescent sterility, and it's not that prevalent. Then start giving yourself a baby every 24 to 27 months, which is the average for populations that breastfeed maybe 6 months to a year and do not contracept. And then figure it out and figure if you'd be sitting around the table at a university here right now. All right? The most visible difference between in Afghanistan versus the Acholi is women's extremely limited freedom of movement, even when they're wearing a burqa. And you know what's really the worst thing about a burqa that you tell me if you agree with this, it's like there's no peripheral vision because that little square with all the little cross hatch thingies is so narrow, and the crosshatch thingies are like coarse fiber, and the little fibers that come off of them make everything blurry. You can't see worth a damn. And anyway, now it's not just the danger of war. In Kabul, when we went around, and always in armored vehicles, except that one time, and another time when I went shopping on Chicken Street, which is another story, okay? But, so 90% I would say is male turf, except near the ministries. Everywhere else, except near the ministries, most women wear burqas. And they don't do it because they are so conservative, and they don't embroider the burqas. They don't put any signs of individuality on them, because they make you anonymous. And that's the point. You don't want anybody to know who is under there. And oh boy, I have really sincerely wished I had one on that long walk. Let's move on. Men out on the street, they're protesting or proclaiming somebody. Women inside, wearing their burqas, although some are showing their faces, waiting at a clinic to have their kids seen. Moving on. The country's 77% rural. These are the statistics. Only 8% of women do wage work outside the agricultural sector. Only 6% of women over the age of 26 have ever been in a schoolroom. Female illiteracy is 88%. Mobility restriction is very high. Women have no control over their fertility. They have a total fertility rate, that's what TFR means, of between 5.6 and 6.3. The statistics vary because they're not very precise. Half of the population is under 18. Women's rights to land ownership and inheritance is totally denied in most instances. A total of only 1.87% of women were found to own or even have any rights to land in a recent UN study in 2004. 5% of women own businesses. 22% of MDs are women. 17% of nurses are women. And here's catch-22. Only a woman can treat another woman. Result, world's second highest infant mortality rate. Okay, unlike Afghan villages, women are not confined to their huts. This is what it looks like in Acholi villages. Okay, women in the water. Now this was the biggest need in the camps. Even, I mean, they could have walked to the, they could have walked to the village even though the road was overgrown, but you can't fix the wells until you can get equipment in there, so that's why you need your infrastructure. But I just wanted to give you some statistics of their daily life. All right, the average village woman, once she left the camp, because all the camps had good water pump systems that were on premises, okay? Once back in the village, she had to fetch water twice a day. Each time she would carry 25 liters. That, folks, is a 20-liter jerry can. A liter is a kilogram, 2.2 pounds, so that can weighs 44 pounds. The average woman also carries a 5-liter can with her that weighs 11 pounds. So she is carrying 55 pounds of water. She may have a kid on her back because she's got the jerry can on her head, and who knows what else. She is overburdened. The average distance to water ranges between it's rarely less than a kilometer. It's usually several kilometers, and the most extreme, it's more than 2 miles. They do this twice a day. On the way back, they're carrying 55 pounds. Okay? Just you think about that. Some women have bikes, but they are very rare. And you see these women are putting 4 jerry cans on this one bike. But A, they're allowed to be out on the roads in bikes, but B, very few women can afford them. Okay, now, when we asked them, 100% of the Acholi who were not in the camps said they preferred to be back in their villages, and that was even the women. Now remember, in the camps, land rights were irrelevant to both sexes, and in the camps, women improved their relative position, becoming important family providers. But all the women we interviewed also said they preferred to leave the camps. By March, April 2010, which was a few months after the ceasefire, only 10 or 15% of the original camp population was still there, and they were the basket cases. Ask me a question afterwards, and it's sort of heartbreaking. Okay, so the changes continue, and women's relative position is better, although they still don't have land rights. Now what for the women in their societies? Now, we know that Afghanistan is heading for what we call transition, which is pulling out the American and other troops by the end of 2014. Every woman I spoke with, everyone, and the things that I was doing the final evaluations on had nothing to do with gender. One was the Afghanistan National Development Strategy, the other was the Afghanistan National Development Program, but I managed, part of the people I interviewed, were women in different ministries, in different organizations. Everyone spoke that there was going to be a sellout of women's right to work and girls' education, and if the Taliban would not come back informally, that they would make a deal that would leave them totally screwed, I guess would be maybe not the politest way to say it, but what they're all telling me. Now, the LRA are no longer killing, mutilating, and rampaging in northern Uganda. That was the ceasefire. Now they're doing it in Congo, all right, and a few other places, like Sudan. So far, the Acholi women can continue to build an economic base, and their children seem likely to benefit. They want to educate them, etc. Afghan women seem unlikely to do so, and their country is likely to stay very patriarchal, even though we put in a quota that the U.S. insisted on political quotas. There are 25.5% women in the lower house and 25.7% in the Senate. And some of them are incredibly gutsy women, but most of them are female relatives of the men who are already there. And besides, it's irrelevant because this is the amount of power that they have. Okay, let's move on. So here is a conclusion. 2 more anecdotes. That was already here. It was, okay, so I already did that, my bad. And then, let me say this one, this is a good anecdote. What happened when the Minister of Women invited Karzai, the Prime Minister Karzai, and the whole cabinet consisting of 25 ministers, 24 of them men, for International Women's Day? Ask me the questions. Countries whose women do not contribute to economic and human capital growth have less than both, and they also tend to have more armed conflict. Very high conflict states often are like Afghanistan. They're patriarchal, they're poor, they have high fertility, whether the woman wants it or not, they have low education, so ignorant women raise ignorant, unhealthy children, and they raise violent youth who have few job opportunities that don't involve shooting something. So they are threats to all of us in today's world, but the good news is globally, increasing income for women is far more common than war and armed conflict. So and increased income for women happens to be A, or perhaps the, according to the Economist study in 2006, top driver of GDP growth nationally and for the world economy. And in 2006, the Economist analyzed 20 years of economic expansion worldwide from 1985 to 2005, and they had three principal factors that they identified as likely to be the most consequential. One was the rise of China and India, China starting in '79, India in the early 90s. The second one was the rise of computer technology and the internet. All this happened in the same period. The third was the increasing female labor force participation in the rich, i.e. advanced industrial countries. And to their surprise, of the three, all were important, but the one that was most important turned out to be women's increased labor force participation. So let's go on to questions and answers, and I hope I haven't taken too much time.
Thank you very much. Very brief information before we start the question. I wanted, because you are leaving, I wanted to let you know that's the beginning of a seminar series on development, and I'd like you to sign your name here and email, so we will send you the information. We will have, next speaker will be Professor Faton, from the Politics Department, followed up by Janine Braithwaite, and then Sarah Spatty. Yes, and Professor Richard Handler, etc. So please come, I'm going to give you a pencil, and then we start the questions.
You're not going to get your food fight. I guess you're not going to get your food fight.
Well, but she's still signing it. She may have to just be loading up for it. Okay.
You guys just have to step into their place.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Okay, so you have nothing to say about the development then? And as you leave, what do you think? Any change of opinion, or is it all bad, or what?
No, oh gosh, it's not all bad. I actually think you both had incredible points that I sometimes forget, and it was great to be reminded. And I do have questions actually for both of you. I just have to run. I mentor a 14-year-old girl, so I have to pick her up from school right now. But I do want to sit down with both of you at some point if possible. I emailed you a few weeks ago.
You did? You emailed me again. I'm on leave and I'm in and out this semester, okay? Email me again.
Thank you so much, and you too, sir. Thank you, I appreciate it.
Thank you. Again, I've been very surprised by the inheritance question.
Yeah.
Knowing that Afghanistan is a Muslim country.
Right.
They should be the Taliban.
Yeah. So, I don't know for sure. It's possible that there are places where it's honored, but I understand that in general what happens is that the girls' brothers kind of insist that if you ever want a place to come and stay, if you need it, you give us control of what you get. So I'm not sure about, and I did not study it, so maybe I think inheritance because in the rural areas in particular, you know, the brothers will step in and say, you can come, you know, you can either come to us in a case of crisis or you can hold on to your inheritance.
Well, that's why in Islam they are giving half of the share.
Yeah,
of the
exactly.
half. Because they can, but they still have the half.
But what I'm saying is that the de facto that is told that the brothers take over the women's half share.
Yeah. Certain places like in India, like, and it's not the Muslim area, women get the jewelry, big deal.
Yeah.
But they do not inherit it. But I was wondering if there was a sort of compensation to that. It's incredible. It's very, very sad.
Yeah.
As a young woman, hearing what you were talking about really did kind of get me thinking just about like my counterparts or my peers in these developing countries where they don't have the opportunities necessarily, except for maybe agriculture, as you were talking about. But would you say that one way for someone like myself to get involved would be putting money into those microloans that they give to women in developing countries? Are there other ways to?
There are so many ways. First of all, microcredit is somewhat controversial now because there were these two terrible in two countries, there were these greedy for-profit organizations that had IPOs and they started charging exorbitant rates of interest. The two countries were Mexico and then India. And in India, particularly in the state of Andhra Pradesh, and what happened is that every one of these organizations, you know, that were for profit, started handing out loans indiscriminately. They didn't ask if you had a loan with anybody else. They basically were just giving them out like candy. And then they had enforcers that you associate with the Sopranos, you know, like enforcers who would come around and take what you had, and it would be horrific. Some of these women ended up killing themselves, pretty much wiping out all microcredit in the state of Andhra Pradesh and giving a black eye to microcredit. But I will say that this was two countries, and microcredit is now in most countries in the developing world. As I say, Bangladesh is saturated. It's actually lowered the poverty rate there. And most of the, Muhammad Yunus is just appalled by this tendency. He wrote a letter in the New York Times saying,
We've had him here.
Yeah, we have. And he, in person, is even more awesome. But anyhow, so what I'm saying is you may read saying, oh, microcredit sucks. This is not true. Most of the programs that use what we call best practices will, in fact, become, they'll cover their operational costs in about 3 to 5 years. They can be fully profitable in 5 to 7 years. That means they're sustainable. And some of them use models like village banking, where the women themselves can decide how much they want to grow their assets versus giving loans at low interest. But there are all these variations. They also have these programs where you can donate money on the internet and it will eventually get to somebody in some kind of a program. Or you can look into it. We used to have an outfit here on grounds called Seeds. And anyhow, we also had another one called the Microfinance Organization. Both have now been absorbed by GDO, the Global Development Organization. So if you're interested in any of this stuff, go to one of their meetings. And the president this year is Melina Chopra, the daughter of Len Chopra, the Dean for Arts and Sciences. And you can find out when they're meeting next, or contact Richard Handler, who is in charge of Global Development Studies, because he works with them too.
Who did Brad Brown work with when we
And
went?
Brad Brown also?
With BRAC.
Yeah, Brad.
Right.
But I think when we went and heard the talk, the theater, you know, and Ramin Bey is Muhammad Yunus, it's
But
never
it
had
depends
that
what you're
reputation.
looking for. If it's for an internship, if it's for studying here, if it's after graduation.
But what you can do.
Okay, let me sneak in a couple of, you asked two questions, a middle level question and a profound question. Let me talk about the middle level question first, which is microcredit. Never mind the scandals. Scandals are bad, but I think you correctly characterized them as a few bad eggs and otherwise good
Right.
movement. The complicating factor of microcredit, and I am a big microcredit, in fact, for a long time, 100% of my charity went to microcredit. I'm still in a microcredit club. So once you acknowledge them in the family and rah rah. Countries vary in their supply of microcredit. From everyone's in there, everyone's get it, and enough already, versus this isn't really happening. And the American tendency of I want to go where I want to go because it's cool and I'm going to provide microcredit because they need things. You know, just like I'm going to feed the hungry, what if they have enough food but they don't have enough something else? You make up your mind what they need, not knowing the context, and you come and force it down people's faces. You can do a careful site-by-site place and say, where is microcredit underdeveloped, and then work from there. Keep in mind, there's two other complications on microcredit, which is just, you know, if you're going to go to be useful as opposed to go for summer vacation, all right? There is a gigantic debate in microcredit about which I am agnostic. One argument claims that it's essentially a welfare function. You want to get as many loans out to people as they can, you want to make sure they're paid, but it's not about sustainability. If microcredit worked by having to acquire on regular infusions of charity capital in order to keep it going, and ultimately the money dissipates, not a problem, the money's going where it's needed the most. This is the sort of original model of microcredit where it's supposed to be sustainable. Well, sustainability is not a big issue. Using the buzzword sustainability, which means other things in ecology, is therefore very cool in development circles. Some people say that you should not have that pool of capital dependent on philanthropic needs. In that case, it has to be sustainable. In that case, you need to have a look at good risks versus bad risks. And when the smoke clears, middle-income people are better risks than poor people. Now, on one hand, there's a lot of economic development that... What?
I disagree with you, go ahead.
Okay. On one hand, if you take that logic, you could argue that middle-income people are as closed out of bad banking systems as good ones, and that well, it's not glamorous to give something to Uncle Jules to open up a cell telephone store. That is a legitimate enterprise. In other cases, that's questionable. Regardless of whether you stand on the issue, you heard me as being agnostic on the issue, you want to know before you go which side you're on. If you throw yourself into the first person who says, we'd like someone to help with microcredit, and that's often what you do, you take the first opportunity, you may find yourself very much on the wrong side of the debate doing a policy you don't believe in. Now, there's a more profound question you asked. Most people think about microcredit because it's the best thing they can do, but often it's a subset of a question I used to be asked by students seeing them all the time. I want to do good for the world. I'm an undergraduate in an American institution. What can I do for my career and my life that will make a positive difference? That's often the big question people have. And I have a take that I know Ray is going to disagree with, and it's a controversial one, but it's one that doesn't get enough respect around here. You can go to the wonderful places of the world and make a difference and help in the traditional sense. The people who need changing, the people who need fixing, the people who are broken are the Americans. They're the ones with the money doing all of these abysmal things, forcing things down third world people's throats. And you don't necessarily have to go to Washington and be an NGO or the State Department to do that. Many people are envisioning an NGO type job. If you ask me the number one thing you could do that would create broadly dispersed growth in the third world, I would say get Americans to buy more third world labor intense products, and preferably not in a sweatshop. So in other words, just getting really, really cheap sneakers, it's labor intensive, but that's not what I have in mind. Let me start with two obvious conditions starting in the industries I studied. There are 1 million amazing musicians and artists all over the third world who are starving to death or can sell only to their own. And the amount of foreign exchange you can create is suddenly someone likes the great instrumentalists or the, you think about the Caucasus, which produces some of the greatest music on the face of the earth, traditional, globalized, take your pick. What it would do to these countries if these artists got their fair recognition and they were selling albums the way Madonna does, that would have a huge effect on the countries that you come from. Tourism. I don't practice what I preach. My last vacation was Portugal. It should have been, never mind Costa Rica, that's somewhat good at it. You can put your money in the places that make the difference, and when you leave, your money stays. A lot of people would not go to a place like Colombia because they're afraid they'll get killed. Okay, oh my God, blah, blah, blah. But there are ways to get the people with cash in and out, dropping their money on local rather than globalized enterprises, which will have gigantic multiplier effects for that. And then, sure, you get to go to these countries all you want, and you work with all sorts of people, but you will bring in more money with consumers than just about with any other mechanism I can think of.
I'm so sorry.
You gotta go. Goodbye. See you later.
Thank you all so much.
Okay, we have
You're
so
a very
many
patient person.
opportunities on grounds for international involvement, study abroad, semester at sea, J term, May term, et cetera, et cetera. So there's just,
Yeah.
thanks, Elizabeth.
Thank you so much.
You're very welcome. One more question?
Yeah, I wanted to ask you actually, so
Yeah.
there's those who believe in the rise of Africa are kind of citing that there's women who are taking leadership positions, like politically.
Right.
To what extent do you think that's true? Like,
Well, what's interesting in Africa is that the SADC, the Southern Africa Development Community, imposed a political quota of 30%, which they're now thinking of maybe even upping to 50%. And the 14 nations in the SADC increased the proportion of women in politics, and then they started to get, the first woman president, Ellen Sirleaf Johnson, in Liberia. And so I think that politically, it's a good trend. Uganda is number 35 out of 189 countries, and it has about 35% women in its legislature. As I say, Afghanistan, about 25-point-something%. But that's the problem. Political representation is not the same as global political power, like controlling the major ministries, etc. And in some countries, the parliament doesn't really do all that much. So if I had to put a bet on which type of power, I would say economic power will have more consequential effects in a shorter period of time, in a wider array of arenas than political power. But I think it's terrific that being pushed by SADC, now other African regions are starting to increase their representation of women in parliament. And quota systems are now spreading around the world. Over 100 countries, I think it's 110 now, have them. But it hasn't brought about major change because in most countries parliaments are not that consequential.
and when you say that Americans are the broken ones, do you mean like they do give money? Like, right, there are people who do care, but I think the people in charge are kind of using the wrong policies because they're not accountable, right, on the ground level. Is that what you mean?
Well, I mean many different things. Although I know this gets me in trouble with other members of the progressive ecological left, and they're doing good things, every time I think buy local, I think that's a set of poor people in a faraway country who are basically, to my mind, buy local often is the same as buy white. Buy from us, okay? Our group, we're going to take care of ourselves. I think when I think about, say, our policies involving immigration, and the way we treat people who want to come and stay in our country and what we make them go through to get in, the complete prejudice that we have against all of these places in the world, number of things, and I even ignored the biggest thing. Often we really want to see world poverty get rid of, but we like our lifestyle. I like my sushi. I like my sushi to be inexpensive and really high quality. I'm not going to ask too many questions about where it came from and what the labor conditions were like on the boat. And I want my sushi today. I'm not thinking about how many fish there's going to be in the ocean later on. And in fact, when we talk about the evil, horrible, terrible corporations that do sometimes wonderful things and sometimes awful things out there, they're very much responding to what the American consumer is demanding as the final voice. And so the logical extrapolation of consumer preferences If they want the cheapest of all possible clothing, no questions asked, and sweatshops will be made that drive people into the dirt to get the cheapest of all possible clothing. And if they want to make sure that their standards of living are high and they're not competed against by other groups, we can try to trash, pass tariffs against or exclude people who are competing with my jobs, so that if there's going to be poverty, I'm covered and you have the problem rather than me. I mean, this isn't, the long-standing tariff policy we had for a long time, the higher tax the import, the higher the tariff we put on, because we'd let you bring in cheap agriculture, but we wouldn't let them bring in sophisticated products. All of that comes in, so we have all sorts of, and we won't even talk about what goes on in the financial world and the maintenance of debt repayment programs and what we ask for. And fiscal austerities that we impose on everyone else in the world that we would never remotely tolerate for ourselves, even when neither our conservatives nor our liberals would take that. Think about the taxes that we're asking for from the rest of the world, and what those same people are thinking when you ask to tax our own population. At that level, the number of things that are profoundly wrong with the harm that America creates for the world, that list of sins goes out the window, and in fact, you can work on anyone you want, it would make a difference.
I would like to clarify one thing, and that's that I wasn't just making a blanket negation of what you said. All right, microcredit, when you have the so-called best practices programs, one of the criteria, let's say, they're generally used for short-term working capital, 3-4 month loans. And the better programs require a minimum of 6 months and preferably 1 year in business as a micro-entrepreneur before you're eligible for a loan, okay? Especially the ones that are operating with credit only. Now, some of the other models are trying to do startups, village banking, they do startups. And so when we look at the best practices programs and you have experienced micro-entrepreneurs, the poor tend to pay better. No one ever gave them a break before, and they were paying the money lender, and now they have a much lower rate of interest on their short-term working capital, and so for them this is heaven and believing. They will move heaven and earth to pay it back. When you are doing the broader array, which includes some of these sort of do-good programs, not best practices, including some of the models like village banking that do permit startups, then if you go too far down the ladder to women who have never been in business, who are too poor, no, they're not going to do as well as middle-class women who are given the same opportunity. So that to me is I've done microcredit in 16 countries, okay? And so this is the best summary I think I can give you of the
So
literature.
there's a simple fact, if you really if you ask me, here's a microcredit program in abstract, regardless of what philosophy it claims to espouse, what makes microcredit programs work and not work is the quality of the underwriting. How well you know the individual you're lending it to, and whether or not the loan you're giving makes sense or not sense. And in the rush to microcredit, many unflattering word for not very good microcredit programs were set up that whatever sector they thought they tossed things in, and then when they were in trouble, got ugly about how to collect. And in fact, bad loans that turn ugly in how they collect reminds me of a certain financial crisis in the United States,
Right.
which often macro credit is run with the same complete stupidity. And for that matter, internationally, the origin of the third world loans that occurred in the 70s that led to the debt crisis in the
Right.
80s. At any level of money, bankers are notorious for going soft on underwriting, getting themselves in a jam, and then taking a pint of blood to get their money back,
Right.
when they should have done the job the first time. And whether you kill people, one poor person, one poor woman at a time, or whole nations and continents at a time,
Okay.
it still comes down to the underwriting.
But have you heard of solidarity groups? You're talking about underwriting. If you let a group come together with ideally 5 people, and each one knows that they're going to have to guarantee each other's loan, then what they tend to do is a really good job of risk assessment. And this is why the programs aimed at the very poor frequently use the solidarity groups, because they do all the transaction costs of figuring out who to loan to. Now, when you have best practices with individual loans, then you pay your loan officers mediocre salaries and offer them nice bonuses, and they get their bonus from two factors: keeping their portfolio below a certain rate of arrears, generally 5%, and getting a certain number of new clients every month. And this means that they will beat the bushes and get all the information on local reputations to find the most responsible clients who will keep up their payments. And lo and behold, women tend to be better at repayment, especially on-time repayment, than men. And so the more computerized a best practices program is, the more it has computerized MIS, the more likely it is to feminize. Study done by FAO, I'll give you the reference. And the reason is that the low number of officers could come in, turn on their computers, look at their portfolio and see who was paying, and it turned out that on average, because they disaggregated by sex or gender, the women were paying better.
Yeah.
So this is what happens.
Started with men and then.
Yeah, 64% men, and now he's 98% women.
But
It's
when
nice
he,
to see that result.
when he came and spoke, so many things in your talk reminded me of what Mohammed said.
Yeah.
And the things he said is, well, what I like too is, so say there's a group of 7 women, and we give you a loan, and number 2, she does not get that loan until number 1 is paid.
That's another
So
one.
what do they call it in sociology?
Well, it's called solidarity groups, that's
Well,
what
but
they
it's
call them.
called social pressure.
Peer
Or
pressure.
something like that.
Yeah.
And then also, Eunice said, and he was very direct about it, that when you gave money to men, they drank it and gambled it.
Yeah.
And when you gave it to women, they worked their butts off and then they educated their children.
And the health and
Which is
community.
everything you.
But I still object to excluding men. I think that is a terribly
I don't know,
short-sighted
does he exclude men?
policy.
Does he exclude men?
In a lot of the places, like,
From me?
take Finca. Finca in Africa, in some of the African countries where I've worked, will not loan to men, and I have recommended against, whatever project I've been involved with, dealing with them, because to exclude the men causes resentment, it can cause domestic violence, all kinds of things like that. And so, because in Indonesia, which admittedly is more gender egalitarian, nevertheless, the government has run the BKK program for decades, and it's about 50-50 men and women, and so it can be done. But on average, yes, the women have a better repayment record, especially an on-time repayment record. But this does not
Yes,
mean
that's
that men are
100%.
not, capable of being good microcredit clients.
When we went and saw the movie that Brad Brown brought in, what was that like?
Grooming.
Oh, it was Ramin. And Ramin was landing in Brooklyn,
Yeah.
so it's not just,
Except that the amounts, $50 is not going to go very far in Brooklyn. Yeah. And so, yeah.
but I mean, he identified us as a meeting place as well.
Yeah, Axiom is actually, I think they're still in a few cities, but the amount of the loan that's needed is so much greater in the United States than it is in, a country like Bolivia or Haiti or something like that, there's really no comparison.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Oh, thank you. And what's your name?
What time is it?
Lazar? Okay, well, good luck to you guys.
Oh, as you said last question a while ago.
Engineers who are doing all these water projects, they are awesome. They are building really nice water systems all over the world, in Africa and India and all that. And if you, I think that Majida has the program, and so it certainly Cliff does, from our conference in November. And there was a session on engineers in water projects. And if you write to Cliff and get his email, he, I'm sure, can send you a copy of the names in that session, and you might consider taking a course with them or just going to talk with them in their office hours. So if you're still interested in development, you've got this whole nucleus of engineers in this university who are really doing good work.
I'm actually not an engineer. I'm just like a pre-medical student. I'm a biology.
Oh, I thought you said you were an engineer. Okay.
No, but I mean, I definitely do look out for like development.
Okay, I misheard you.
No, but
Sorry.
the health is, for all the stuff that she was mentioning about the effects of women's status and all the positive benefits she mentioned, the outright commitment to health and health per se has a gigantic implication on all this stuff. And anything you can do to work with that, especially since what's often shocking about this stuff is when you go down there, what's causing the deaths isn't, sometimes there's high tech that's used. I know people like making killing funguses with special local clays and fancy pharmacological tricks. In a lot of cases, what you can see is just flagrantly obvious. It's just getting the $75 as it takes to get the rural nurse or the water supply out there. What's going on is cheap, not rocket science, and nobody's doing it.
Well, what you said about the utilities, how huge that is.
Oh, it's huge.
Yeah, we're closing or ending funding anybody who, Planned Parenthood and anybody who, even provides abortion.
Yeah, but most of what they do is services to poor
I know,
women, and they do
I know.
pap smears, and they do.
And some don't even provide abortion, and we shut them.
I know.
Because of our politics.
So we are, thank you very much for coming. We're going to keep some energy from Professor Blumberg and Cohn because we're working tonight, the three of us. So,
It's Valentine's Day.
it's Valentine's Day. I know.
Yes.
But we can also do great work. And we're out tonight.
Well, thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you.